Pleased to welcome to the studio Professor Sir David Omand, who's former Director of GCHQ, Permanent Secretary of the Home Office and the first UK Government Security and Intelligence Coordinator. Thank you for coming in, Sir David. It is understandable people are focusing on whether parties did or did not take place at number 10 and whether Prime Ministers were or were not in attendance and whatever else it might be, and the battle against COVID and the job to get vaccinations in arms. But shall we look at global affairs? How concerned should we be about Russian involvement in Ukraine? Morning to you.
Good morning, Nick. Very concerned. This is one of those moments in history which will shape the next 10, 20, 30 years. We have to stand up as democracies for what we believe in. On the other hand, Russia, under President Putin, has developed a view of the world which brings them really into conflict over Ukraine, as they have over in the past Georgia. So we've got to stand firm, but on the other hand, we've got to put ourselves in the mind of President Putin to see what is it he really, really wants.
You anticipated my next question, David. What is Putin's game plan, do you imagine? How do you divine it?
None of us really know.
No, of course.
We're inferring from his actions. And he's placed 100,000 troops on the border with Ukraine. He's saber-rattling. He's threatened the NATO nations. He wants to get himself and Russia into a much stronger global position, back to where somewhere nearer to where the old Soviet Union was.
Well, that's what a lot of commentators say. He actually hasn't given up on the old Soviet Union. He believes he wants to sort of bring it back, or as much as he can.
I'm sure he would be much happier if, at the time, President Yeltsin had driven a harder bargain and the West had conceded that Ukraine would remain as a neutral state and would not be allowed to join a military alliance. He may have in mind the precedent of Austria. In 1955, the US, the UK, France agreed with the Soviet Union that Austria would always remain neutral. It's in a treaty. And that was the basis on which the Red Army withdrew from the part of Austria they occupied after the Second World War. But that was then. That was the sort of Yalta-era carve-up of Europe. You can't now expect free nations to say we're going to be dictated to and told we can't, for example, apply in some point in the future for NATO membership. But it's not a current issue. Ukraine is not about to join NATO.
I mentioned the Financial Times. The other end of the scale for some, perhaps, is the Sun newspaper. They have a story. Ben Wallace, who is, of course, the Defence Secretary, says the West must prepare for the worst, prepare for war. Sir David.
I would be careful about language which implies that we are on some course towards war. I don't believe we need to be. But he's right that if you haven't got the determination to defend yourself, your principles and your values through the NATO alliance, then we're in a very bad situation. So I understand what he's saying and I agree with it. You just have to be a little careful about threatening war over a country with whom we don't have a defence alliance.
What should the UK, the US and NATO be doing then, in your view, Sir David?
Redoubling our efforts to understand what is in the mind of the Russian leadership. See the world through their eyes, not necessarily to agree with their worldview, I'm sure we wouldn't, but we do have to get inside their minds to understand what is their bottom line, what is it that they most fear. Is there a way through diplomacy we can actually negotiate something which will put them more at ease with a world in which nations like Ukraine don't want to be part of a reborn Soviet empire.
How emboldened would Russia be by what would appear to be the catastrophic evacuation in Afghanistan last year?
That's one element in the calculation. They would also be emboldened by the Trump era.
Why so?
The division within the United States, which some commentators in the States are actually seeing it as a move potentially towards secessionist. Civil war is a term that some commentators are using. That's probably almost certainly exaggerated, but nonetheless the United States is deeply divided. The European Union has been gravely weakened by our Brexit. They're no longer, certainly at the moment, a diplomatic power.
Has our security been undermined by Brexit, UK security?
Not in a direct sense. I think we're less well placed to tackle things like crime, international crime, than we were when we were integrated into the police networks. But in terms of our main security, of course, comes from NATO and our membership of NATO. But that depends crucially on the United States. And President Trump, as president, went out of his way to cast doubt on that.
Which poses the greater threat, Russia or China?
Depends on the timescale you're looking at the moment.
Well, get me to the end of my days.
Well, your days looking at you, Nick, I would say...
Another 10 in me, hopefully.
I would say the risk of trouble with Russia, continuing trouble, their attempts to undermine, subvert through digital subversion, all the grey zone activity that goes on, that's here and now. I think with China, it's a longer-term game. But if President Xi decided that in his lifetime Taiwan had to return to the fold and be part of the one China in practice, then that would create a very serious situation.
Can you divine what China's long-term game might be?
I think you can infer from the last few years that the President Xi wants to consolidate the strength of China, particularly its technological strength. He's put a lot of effort into artificial intelligence. He wants to ensure that the population continue to support him in that. So there's a lot of manipulation of the population through digital means and collection of data. And he wants to be secure. And for China, Taiwan is part of China.
I've mentioned the collapse of Afghanistan, or the taking of it by the Taliban. What has that done? How will that impact security for the United Kingdom? Not
directly. It does depend on what attitude the Taliban take to harbouring in the future terrorist movements. That was where it all started, with their support for Al-Qaeda and the training camps, which had to be forcibly removed from Afghanistan after the 9/11 attacks. So it all depends, I think, on how the Taliban react. But of course it's much harder for us to keep an eye on what is going on inside a country that is under Taliban rule.
Well, we'll talk about the spies in just a moment. We're going to be a little bit late to the news because we've got Professor Sir David Omand in the studio. Last couple of questions, just coming back to that. A number of people, including some politicians, fear that the thousands of people that we see trying to make the crossing from France to the United Kingdom or Belgium to the United Kingdom, sometimes they could be harbouring agents of the Taliban. There could be people, those from other countries. How real is that threat?
I'm not aware of evidence that that is a chosen route for would-be terrorists to smuggle themselves in. The threat we face from terrorism domestically is real. It comes from the far right as well as from the violent jihadist supporters. A lot of it, I fear, is domestic. It's already here.
What gives you that knowledge? Why do you say that?
I think the experience of the attacks which have taken place and those that the security service say they have frustrated which is a significant number, over the last few years.
Noting that you are almost a career civil servant, you were permanent secretary of the Home Office, you were the first UK government security and intelligence coordinator. When you hear criticism of the civil service recently, such as it's a blob, or Dominic Cummings saying it needed, quotes, a hard rein, how do you respond?
With irritation and some understanding. It's a big the civil service is large. The nation depends on it. It's going to be the focus of criticism. Things do go wrong sometimes, and I felt this kind of frustration when I was serving. It is a little slow. It's a supertanker that takes time to change course. But it's not a blob. It's filled with very dedicated people. And if we didn't have people, as we do, thankfully, with that sense of public service, then how on earth would we have, for example, got through the pandemic?
You featured in the Chilcot inquiry. You questioned some of the actions and decisions that were taken in relation to the Iraq conflict. As a result of that, I have to ask you, does your former boss, Tony Blair, deserve to be Sir Tony?
Yes, I think he does. I think it's...
Reminding you what Chilcot said, he presented it with a certainty that was unfounded. The case for war with a certainty that was unfounded, Sir David.
I would say the principal charge in the Chilcot inquiry was the failure of judgment. But all prime ministers, one time or another, make failures of judgment. This was a particularly bad one, and he has had to endure, rightly, a great deal of criticism of that decision. But does the sovereign does she retain that right to bestow this personal award on a man who won 3 general elections, who made the Labour Party electable, and who did so much good? I just remind you of the Northern Ireland settlement. What other Prime Minister would have had the persistence to ensure that that conflict was brought to an end?
So John Major did some heavy lifting there, though, didn't he?
Sorry?
Did Sir John Major did do some heavy lifting?
Indeed, and it was Margaret Thatcher who initially authorised the first tentative steps. But it was the Blair administration that brought it home. And he deserves our thanks for that, even if he did make some serious mistakes as well.
We're way late to the news. Final question. You have a book, which is now in paperback. It went paperback. How Spies Think, 10 Lessons in Intelligence. You were director of GCHQ. Professor Sir David, what makes a good spy?
What makes a good intelligence officer? That's not the same as being the agent that the intelligence officer recruits.
What makes a good intelligence officer?
What makes a good intelligence officer is, first of all, a devotion to the service that they are trying to undertake for the nation. They're not mercenaries. They're not working for profit. They're working for the safety of the country and the public. You start there. Then you have to have the qualities of imagination, of intelligence, the ability to read other people. These are all the qualities that you would need to be a success.
Do you enjoy the Bond movies?
Oh, hugely. But they have nothing whatever to do with the gathering of secret intelligence. The ideal intelligence officer is the person. He or she walks into a room and you don't even notice they've come into the room.
They don't come in an Aston Martin.
If Daniel Craig walks into a room, heads will turn.
They will. He got the Order of St Michael and St George in the New Year's Honours. That normally goes to spies and people like you. Was that right?
Yes, I mean, it's one of those little British quirks, isn't it? It's a little bit of eccentricity. In the same way as a previous head of the service, the C, as they call them, got Her Majesty's permission to fly the Union flag at night at Vauxhall Cross in their headquarters because, as he said to Her Majesty, our best work is done in the dark.